Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Photographers for People and Planet podcast. And Happy New Year! This is the first episode that's coming out in 2025, and I am so excited for you to listen to it. So this episode is with an amazing guest, somebody who isn't from the world of photography, but somebody who I've been following for a number of years, whose work I really, really admire in the area of sustainable travel. And so I am really excited to have her on the podcast today to talk about the intersections of travel, sustainability, and our work as destination wedding photographers. So here you go. I hope you enjoy the episode. And once again, Happy New Year from me. I am really excited to welcome to the Photographers for People and Planet podcast today a wonderful guest called JoAnna, who is someone I've followed for quite a while. And I'm excited that she is here today. So JoAnna, I'm going to throw this over to you. If you can just introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about your background.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me here today, Kat. It is an honor to be talking with all of you today. I am JoAnna Haugen. I am the founder of Rooted, which is a solutions platform at the intersection of sustainable and regenerative tourism practices, storytelling, and social impact. And I'm talking to you today from my home in Bucharest, Romania. The work I do primarily in the tourism industry is really focused around, ensuring that our marketing, communication, storytelling has a positive impact on the world, that we're being really mindful of how we move around the spaces that we visit and are mindful of the people we interact with. Through Rooted, I work as a speaker, I work as a writer, I work as a consultant, and I'm doing this work with a wide variety of travel companies, destinations, travel content creators, and media companies. And I work with them really to reimagine travel experiences and learn how to communicate in a more mindful and thoughtful way that prioritizes local people, their communities, and the environment, and ultimately so that travelers themselves are learning about this more responsible way of traveling and become word of mouth ambassadors for those people that they then are communicating with about their travels.
Awesome. Such amazing work that you're doing. So in your opinion, what are some of the most important and impactful conversations that you see happening in the travel space at the moment?
That's a great question because, of course, over the global lockdown, which, gosh, what was that, 3 years ago now, 4 years ago now, time has lost all meaning. I remember everybody in our industry talking about building back better. We knew that tourism was causing and exacerbating a lot of challenges all over the world. And coming out of those global lockdowns, I don't know that I can fully say that we have built back better, but certainly we are having more honest conversations about some really serious issues that we need to be talking about when it comes to travel and tourism. That includes the elephant in the room, the ethics of flying, and how tour operators and other travel companies should be creating offerings potentially with alternative transportation options and or learning to incorporate the journey itself into the travel experience and not be so focused on the end place where people end up to travel. So that is certainly a big conversation that we continue to have. Last chance tourism is the idea that people are visiting places that are particularly fragile. And this includes places like Antarctica or the Galapagos Islands or the Great Barrier Reef, places that environmentally speaking are really struggling. And there's this balance that tour operators are struggling with right now about how do we educate people about fragile environments while really reckoning with the fact that travel is accelerating their decline. So, last chance tourism is on a lot of people's minds as well. We are also having ongoing conversations about the importance and the need to better integrate local people's opinions and insights into how tourism should show up in places around the world. I imagine you and many of your listeners have heard the news that came out of Europe in particular this summer about Barcelona and some other cities, but this is not just in Europe, this is happening all over the world. Local residents who are being priced out of their homes and who are finding that places that they love are completely overcrowded by travelers. So there's this need and ongoing conversation about how do we prioritize local people and their needs as it relates to how tourism shows up in their spaces. And of course, the climate crisis is a big challenge that lays across all of these kinds of topics. How we get to a place, how we manage our waste once we're there, how we mitigate any natural disasters, how we manage things like water and food. So, a lot of conversations going on. A lot of solutions are being surfaced at the local level. Still a lot of work that needs to be done, but there is more to travel certainly than what meets the average person's eye when they're thinking about travel experience.
The reason that I reached out to you is because for me, being engaged in sustainability more and more over the last years, hearing these discussions happen in the tourism space and seeing that these conversations aren't happening in the wedding industry, especially when it relates to destination weddings, which really are just an extension of tourism. And when I reached out to you, we spoke about how destination weddings are growing in popularity, and it's not just the people who want to get married abroad who are flying all around the world, in pursuit of these often epic wedding photos, but for photographers themselves as well who are working in the industry, it's really seen as kind of the holy grail of, you've made it as a photographer when you're able to book these destination weddings. And certainly, what I'm seeing a lot in the industry is destinations. There's certain places that are becoming these, and I hate the term, I'm going to inverted commas it, bucket list destinations. And these are often ones that are sought after by the people getting married, by photographers themselves, often because they're also trending on social media. But what are, in your experience in the industry, the impacts of photographers, of couples, potentially guests as well, flying to these destinations around the world for a wedding or for an elopement?
Well, obviously, the biggest thing that we would need to mention is the environmental footprint. Flying has a massive carbon footprint. And there is no escaping that. We can talk about carbon offsets and we can talk about sustainable aviation fuels and all of these up and coming technologies. But the fact of the matter is that flying has a large carbon footprint. And so that should be a consideration for anybody who's thinking about having a destination wedding, and or their photographers that will be there as well. But the environmental footprint doesn't stop there. Every time an additional person goes somewhere, they're using natural resources. They're creating solid waste. They're using water. For something like a wedding, I think it's particularly important to mention the amount of packaging that can be left behind as a result of that wedding. Anything that might be brought in that's wrapped up, that has some sort of packaging, that packaging ultimately ends up in the garbage where that wedding is. And who's taking care of that but your local destination? So there's certainly an environmental footprint here. But it doesn't stop at the environment. There's an economic thing we need to talk about as well. Who specifically is benefiting financially? I know a lot of destination weddings, from my understanding, are held at large international resorts. Many of them are kind of these all inclusive packages, and these tend to be large chains versus locally owned and run accommodations. Those tend to be smaller. They're not built to accommodate a ton of people and big events and things like this. But international chains are notoriously known for removing economic resources from the local community. Ultimately, the money that is brought in for these kinds of events, sure, some of this is trickling down to the wait staff and the folks who are cleaning rooms and setting things up and all this, but a large portion of this is actually leaving the destination. We call that leakage, and it is a very real problem. Also, there are considerations about what is being sourced locally. Are food and flowers and materials that are being used at the wedding being flown in? Or are they locally sourced? Are we supporting local farmers and local growers? Again, it's an economic consideration. And then the other thing that I've noticed with destination weddings is many people are just coming maybe for a weekend or 3, 4 days. And often at these international resorts, again, it's often a kind of all in one package, or people tend to stick around the grounds of the resorts. So then you don't even have guests who are visiting local businesses, who are maybe even venturing out into the neighborhood to hire a local tour guide or buy breakfast at a locally owned cafe. And then there is also a social and cultural cost. And I think this is something that is particularly pertinent for photographers because, of course, they want their photos to be beautiful. This is the whole point, right? But we need to be asking, are people and places being treated with respect? Is there cultural or historical context that should be noted with regard to the backdrops that are being chosen? Or are the places where photos are being taken being used just as pretty backdrops? A lot of these places that are very well known and very popular, whether that is like big ornate doors or maybe beaches or whatever, there's some context for why they are there or why they look a certain way. But when we use those places as props, as something simply to be consumed, then we really disrespect the place that we're visiting. So there are a lot of considerations. It's more than just flying to the destination, but really, how are we treating the destination? What are we leaving behind? Who's benefiting really by our presence of traveling for a wedding or elopement?
Yeah. And actually, you kind of just touched on that. Do you think, because this is something that I kind of see within the industry, that often photographers, even though so many people hate the term now, we are also influencers in the wedding space, in the travel space, especially when it comes to platforms like social media. And, what are the things that we should all be mindful of when we're choosing, especially from a destination wedding, what images that we should share online?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to really underscore there is that photographers absolutely are influencers. And I would go so far as to say is we're all influencers. People turn to their friends and family and social media more than any other places when they're planning their own trips, and thinking about where they're going to go on their holidays. So the way that we present a place on social media matters. And absolutely, pretty places are appealing. When people want to go somewhere, it's often because, we want to quote unquote escape the real world or whatever the case might be. It's like we have an idealized vision of what a place looks like. And that often comes from the way that places are framed or portrayed in social media or in photography. But this is really circular in nature, and I think it's really important to realize the power of that beautiful photo, because when we share a beautiful image, when we share something that people look at and say, oh, I want to go there, I need to see that, I want to take that photo too, these places become popular, they receive attention, people notice them, and then they then choose them for their weddings, for their holidays. And then when they go there, they're taking photos, they're sharing those beautiful photos. They receive more attention, and more people make those decisions. And therefore, the place remains or becomes more popular. And so photographers really feed and perpetuate that cycle by showcasing photos from those places that are desirable places to marry. When you and I talked before this call, you had sent me a list, well, actually a handful of links of some of these popular places for people to get married, or like the top 10 destinations or whatever. And as I was clicking through them, I was like, they look like the same lists to me.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many of the same places appearing over and over again. And that's not a mistake. There's a reason why that's the case. It's a perpetual cycle. And they will continue to stay popular because more people will go, more people will take those photos and share them. So absolutely, those choices to take those photos, share them, and encourage people to have their weddings in those places, it has a great impact. So, what should we be mindful of in sharing those images? I would really encourage photographers to be asking, are the people or places that are appearing in these photos being appropriated in any way? If there are backdrops or props in any way, is it culturally appropriate how they're being represented? Another thing I often see, or that is common just in influencer culture in general, is whether anything's been photoshopped out of a image, and is it being photoshopped out because it's considered quote unquote unpleasant. And when we create an image that is not an accurate portrayal of a place, we're sending a signal about what that place actually looks like, or what people can expect when they're visiting. If we've taken a photo of this beautiful beach and we've gotten rid of the hawker who's selling the stuff in the background and the garbage that's, sort of off to the left side, people are going to expect to see this pristine image when they show up. And what happens then when that's not what they encounter on their special day? I also think there's an opportunity, if photographers are using social media, to just provide additional context, use captions, do Instagram stories or reels or whatever, where you kind of pull back the curtain and provide additional information about these places where you're shooting, about the context of your presence in a place. Those are all opportunities for education. And when we can take a photo and provide more information about what's going on, that is always a good thing to do. That doesn't mean everybody's going to take that information in, but you've at least provided it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are really, really important things to consider. Yeah, I mean, so we've looked at, one of the big things around destination weddings, it is the travel aspect of it. It's hard to ignore the impact of not only the people getting married flying somewhere, but potentially flying also their vendors in too. And people who know me, who know my journey, know that I've been pretty vocal about the fact that I chose to stop flying a few years ago. And, how I very much believe that becoming a local expert in your own backyard is not only one of the most sustainable ways to run a business, but it also allows you to provide a level of service to your clients that is really unrivaled, because you become that local expert. And it's really interesting when I speak to a lot of other photographers, especially those who are earlier on in their journey, that there's a lot of resistance there. I get either people telling me, that won't work for me because I live in an area which doesn't really have any tourism. Nobody wants to get married here. I live in somewhere which is just really boring and uninspiring. And for a lot of people, shooting destination weddings is kind of a goal that they're not willing to give up. So I guess the question is, it's one that's been asked to me many times, and I have my thoughts on it, but do you think it's possible to be a sustainable destination wedding photographer and get paid to shoot weddings all around the world?
I guess I have mixed answers to that question. As we've established, flying is not good for the environment if you're doing it every weekend, if you're crisscrossing the world, several times a month. That is not sustainable, period. And I find it really interesting what you say about a lot of people saying, well, my destination is not appealing. People aren't coming here. And part of why that interests me is because there's so much interest now in getting off the beaten path. As much as I don't really care for that kind of terminology, people actually are, at least in travel in general, seeking more novel places. So, I would ask, why do you need to fall into the bucket list mentality in the first place? Maybe your backyard is the next untapped wonder of the photography world for weddings. I don't know. I mean, I would love to see photographers really expand their thinking beyond, these top 10 bucket list trips. Or at the very least, be thinking, can your travel be expanded a little bit, maybe 6, 8 hours, whatever, if you travel by train or car or some other form of transportation that maybe doesn't keep you right in your town or village, but you can travel throughout the state. Or if you're in Europe, you can hit a certain amount of distance based on 3-4 hours by train. When we travel over land, actually we can cover a fair amount of geography. So and if we can keep ourselves on the ground and out of the air, that is far more sustainable than flying all over the world. If people are very set on doing these destination weddings, and that's part of the appeal, that you want to shoot in Bali, that you want to shoot in Hawaii, that you want to go to these far-flung places that people are getting married, I would encourage people to think about creative ways to at least decrease their environmental footprint. So, for example, can you book several events in Bali over the course of 6 weeks? Can you, go to Hawaii and spend 3 months there and put a wedding on every weekend? How can you maximize your time in a place? The longer you can stay somewhere and the more businesses that you're supporting over that period of time, I would say the closer you get to being more sustainable with your stay, as long as you're, mindful about how you're spending your money and your time. But if you can maximize your time there with more shoots, certainly you're doing a better job than if you're flying halfway around the world for a weekend and then flying home. Mm-hmm. But you do bring up a really good point about the value of being a local expert, because again, you can shoot a beautiful photo, but do you have the context and background information to properly and appropriately represent a place in your photos if you are not a local expert? I would ask if there is a way to expand your geographical reach in a place where you are a local expert, or if you can work in some way with a local person who will automatically be infusing that money back into the local economy. So maybe you're doing the, some of the shooting, but you hire a local videographer or something like that. Anytime we can keep money in a destination, hiring local people, staying at local accommodations, staying longer, those things are all indicators of a more sustainable business plan. And certainly, as you've mentioned, from a customer service standpoint, there is value in working with somebody who's considered a local expert. So I would say that that's actually a great selling proposition, that should be part of your package. Yeah, anytime we can reduce the environmental footprint, be more socially and culturally conscious, and keeping money in local destination, we're doing a better job at being more sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so when it comes to photographers who they do still want to target those destination bookings, often when it comes to how people market for those kinds of things, for a lot of photographers, a way to do that is attending these, what are known in the industry as portfolio building workshops, which often a lot of the ones that I see are run in these popular destinations, often not by locals, or photographers travel to these locations themselves on vacation, and they create sort of these staged, what we call in the industry styled shoots, so sort of mock wedding situations, often with models in these really popular destinations. And yeah, as some of the articles that I sent you, a lot of popular destinations are, places like Iceland, Italy has and always will be popular. Hawaii, Patagonia is becoming more popular. The Caribbean, Southeast Asia, so Bali, like you mentioned, Mexico, Morocco, South Africa. These are all sort of destinations that are becoming more and more popular. And what are some of the things that photographers can potentially be mindful about when they're choosing kind of their, again, I hate the term, but I'm going to use it for ease of kind of reference for people, bucket list destinations as a photographer? So those destinations where they're like, I would love to go there, I would love to shoot there. How do you think they can be mindful in choosing which destinations they want to add to their kind of list of places they want to go and want to shoot?
Well, I mean, going back to the idea of potential co-creation or getting to know somebody who lives in this place, who knows the place very intimately. And I'm not talking about a foreigner who's just set up some sort of workshop, but really taking the time to get to know somebody and have some conversations with them, see the world and their space through their eyes. And maybe that means you arrive at some of these workshops early so that you're spending a week staying in a local accommodation, getting to know, somebody who can show you around, supporting some of the local businesses, maybe taking a cooking class, maybe taking an arts class, these kinds of things, so that you begin to actually know the culture a little bit better. Because I think one of the things that we often do, and we've referenced this throughout this conversation, is this idea of choosing a destination. And a destination is a tourism marketing term. It really separates a place, a home, from a place as that people are visiting, right? It really silos off the local people in their home and travelers and this silo that they're moving through. So I would love to see more people ask themselves, what would I want people to know if they were moving through my home? How would I want people to act if they were visiting the place that I grew up and where I practice my cultural traditions? How do I want people to treat the places that I love? And those are the same questions that local residents have when we travel to them, when we're holding photo shoots and weddings in these places. They're not something to be consumed. So I would encourage anybody who's going to any place, whether that is as a casual traveler or a photographer or a retreat participant or whatever the case might be, is to build in time so that you are learning about the place and not just the backdrop, so that you are aware of the historical and cultural context that makes that place unique and special, and not just looking at it and the things that you see in that place, the artifacts, as simply pretty things that might just appear in the background. It is so easy for people to just show up and consume a place as if they have the right to just do what they want and take what they want from it and leave behind waste and use resources and go home without ever thinking about what it means to be there. So even just taking that time to reflect on the place as a place and not as a destination is a powerful way to be traveling generally more mindfully, whether you're there as a traveler or building your portfolio.
Yeah, I really love that. It's, that's a really big kind of connection for me that I'd never really seen before. And that is, actually referencing a place as a destination. It almost, using that term destination wedding, turns it into this commodity when actually it's just someone else's home.
Yeah, that's right.
And because I work with a lot of photographers across the European realm, and I see these conversations, these frustrations being voiced over and over again. I have friends in Italy, I have friends in Iceland, in Scotland, in Ireland, places which are these trending destinations, where their frustrations are always the same thing of, this is my home, and it upsets them, it hurts them to see how other people treat it, how it feels like other people just exploit it for their own personal gain. And so, I think you have kind of touched on this, but, as photographers, how can we all be more aware of our impact, and that we're not simply extracting from these places and exploiting it for our own personal / business gains?
Well, like I said, if you take the time to educate yourself, and that can be everything from reading books, watching documentaries, listening to podcasts before you show up in a place, that is a great way to educate yourself. But I would, again, encourage people to support a place on the local level. Buy from local makers, stay a couple extra days, and stay at a locally owned accommodation versus the chain. Eat at local places, hire a local tour guide, have conversations. These are the things that make a trip a memorable experience anyway. Yeah. But, something else you could do as a photographer who is traveling halfway around the world to these popular destinations is maybe ask yourself if there's a way to appropriately give back by donating a portion of your profits to a locally run organization, and leave a little bit of yourself behind in a positive way. Can you do something where 10% of your profits are being donated to a couple organizations on the ground? Again, that's kind of a great USP that photographers could have. If you're saying, hey, you book with me and I'm going to be leaving part of the profit behind in this, to this women's cooperative, this, that, or the everything. Of course, we'd never want to exploit these places. And if you can even do those things silently because it's the right thing to do, that's ideal. But you don't do that if you just show up in a place and you don't take the time to learn about it. So educate yourself and support economically the places that you're going to be visiting. And again, reflect on how you'd want people to be acting in your own home and act appropriately in theirs.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really, really great advice. Thank you. Okay, so for photographers who have kind of done a little bit of this work and they've put themselves out there that they want to go to these destinations all around the world, to these locations, um, and they start to get these inquiries, these requests coming in from couples, are there things that people should be mindful of when they're choosing whether they should accept a destination booking request or whether perhaps they might not be right to do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are certainly things that you can be doing yourself as a photographer. Like we already talked about, maximizing the days on the ground. Can you do more than one wedding? Can you combine it with a conference or a personal holiday or anything like that? But I think there are a lot of questions that you can be asking the couple that you are considering working with as well. Why do they want to go to this particular place? And it could be something completely legitimate. Somebody could have family there. It might be part of their heritage. These might be all good reasons for somebody to travel halfway across the world to have a destination wedding. But if the couple is saying to you, oh, we just want to have a beach wedding, maybe that's not the right couple for you. If you have somebody who is going and planning on spending time, maybe doing some volunteer work, extending their own holiday off of the resort, they are potentially embracing a sustainably minded approach to their own wedding. That might be a couple that you want to work with, but you don't want to be part of the problem. You want to be part of the solution by choosing to work with couples who are sustainably minded. I actually don't know how much influence photographers have when they're talking to couples, like if they can nudge them one way or the other in making any sorts of choices. But certainly, if you're educated and you know of somebody who's a great local florist or who does local catering or something like that, perhaps you can offer some suggestions of ways that they can be supporting the local community through their wedding. And I do think at the end of the day, I understand that we're all trying to make money, that, there's no shame in running a profitable business. And so I'm not saying that you should just undercut your profit margin and that's the way to be sustainable. But what you should be really thoughtful of is, what are your ethics? And how are you going to run your company and show up in this world as a global citizen? Are you going to be a steward of the places that you move through? Or are you, again, going to be part of the problem that just accelerates the global challenges that we're facing? So, ask yourself, if I'm running my company ethically, am I actually the right person for this job? And sometimes the answer is going to be no. And then the answer is no. And I think that's okay too. We have to get comfortable in the world that we're living in to say sometimes that we shouldn't be traveling to a place, that we shouldn't be making certain choices when we travel, even though the narrative has always been that it's okay to do those things. We're living in a very extreme world where we need to make hard choices. And that also means that we need to be willing to recognize that we don't have the right to do all the things that we thought we had the right to do before.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, actually. I had just last week a past one of my brides who reached out to me, who their best friend has decided they want to elope to, and that they were considering Japan. And would I be interested in doing that with them? And funnily enough, I actually, in a previous episode of this podcast, I interviewed a photographer who lives in Japan who was telling me about some of the specific cultural issues that they're facing, some of the challenges with photographers coming in from overseas and essentially committing these sort of cultural faux pas. Mm-hmm. And especially in Japanese culture that's very reserved, people were often very offended by these behaviors, but because of the way they were, no one really spoke out about it. Mm-hmm. And it was a really interesting conversation. But as soon as I got that email from this past couple of mine asking if I would go, I immediately gave them the details of this photographer that I now know in Japan and said, no, please contact him, because he will be able to help you have a much more, another buzzword that I hate, but much more culturally authentic experience in a way that's respectful to the local areas, but also somebody who is knowledgeable, who will be able to help connect you with other local people. We'll give you some background about the area. We'll be able to make sure all the places you want to visit, that you are allowed to visit, that you can get permits. And, they're like, oh, actually, that's really interesting. Thank you. But, it was that thing of, for me also, I love traveling, but it's like, no, I'm not the right person for this.
Yeah.
So, no, I think it's great to kind of sometimes have those reminders that, sometimes it's okay to not be the right person for the job.
And you bring up something else that I think is really important for us to remember, is that as we become more educated ourselves about these issues, we have, I would argue, a responsibility to share that information with other people. I often remind people that people don't know what they don't know. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but that potential client that you were speaking to about the cultural etiquette in Japan and why a local person, local photographer likely is the better choice, that is something they might not have been aware of, but because you knew that, you were able to help provide that education to them. And hopefully at some point, as they begin, sharing the story of their own elopement or wedding with other people, they can share that information with them too. This is how we pass this information on. So even if it feels awkward or weird, or you think to yourself, well, don't they know that going to Bali, it's like really overcrowded and they're having a lot of problems with tourists? Honestly, they might not. A lot of people simply are unaware. They don't know what they don't know. So I love that you were sharing that knowledge with somebody, and hopefully they then will pass that knowledge forward in their own stories.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? You don't know what you don't know. And once you know something, you just assume that everybody else knows it. So if there are people who are listening who are kind of realizing, oh, there are things that maybe I'd never thought about before, are there any kind of ways that you would recommend, any resources where photographers who work a lot in kind of travel or travel adjacent, any resources that you recommend that they can engage with?
Um, so, I mean, I spend my time deeply working in the tourism space and thinking about travel in general and not specifically weddings. But I believe, if we're going somewhere and even if we're moving around our own spaces, we're all travelers, even in our own backyards. So I think there's an opportunity for us to learn to be better travelers in general. And I think that the resources available through Rise Travel Institute are really valuable. They just came out with a guide on decolonizing travel, a free guide, very comprehensive, that I think should be required reading, quite frankly, for anybody who's planning on going abroad and really being mindful in how they do that. There's also a really great book called Beyond Guilt Trips. It's written by Dr. Anu Taranath. Again, it is a consumer-facing book for travelers. This in particular is written with the student in, like, a college age student in mind who might be going abroad for university or something like that. But there are a lot of really thoughtful, respectful reflection questions. And I think that, taking some time to think about how we move through a space and what our presence means somewhere is really important, regardless of your reason for traveling. So I think that's another really excellent resource that we should all be looking into, and practices we should be putting in place before we travel. Like I said, I work specifically within the tourism industry, but I'm always tackling these kinds of topics in regard to how we tell our stories, how we share our photos, the kind of information that we choose to share with other people. So I would also love to invite any of your listeners to follow along with my work at rootedstorytelling.com as well.
Amazing. Well, that was going to be my final question to you, was if people do want to connect with
Of
you and
course.
the work that you're doing. Yeah, where is the best place? So on your website?
Yeah, so I do have a newsletter on the website, rootedstorytelling.com/subscribe. I'm going to be launching a more value added newsletter option in the coming month or so, but there's certainly a free newsletter there with a lot of great information. You can find me on Instagram at Rooted Storytelling, and then I'm also on LinkedIn as myself. And I'm always curious about people's journeys as professionals and travelers and citizens of the world in general. So I'd love to have anybody connect with me and share maybe something that they've learned from this conversation or their own thoughts. Because I do think we're all on an ongoing journey. And so I would love to connect with any of your listeners there as well.
Fabulous. Yeah, I love connecting with you like on LinkedIn. I often enjoy reading when you repost things with, a few thoughts. It's great. Like some of those conversations are so insightful. It's amazing. So I will also link all of those in the show notes for people who want to, engage in this further, because I think it's such an important conversation to just be having, to bring more awareness around our impact as humans on this amazing planet that we live on.
Absolutely. And I think, there's no time like the present.
Yeah. Thank you so much, JoAnna. This has been really, really wonderful.